So welcome to A Culture of Respect, a proactive approach for addressing difficult topics in learning spaces. My name is Andrea Echelberger, and I am a literacy teacher at Robbinsdale Adult Academic Programs, and I'm joined here by my colleague.
Good morning. My name is Klas. My pronouns are they, them, and I'm an instructor at the Hub Center in St. Paul. So we're going to sort of unpack this topic in three parts this morning. First, we're going to talk about sort of how you set up routines and guidelines and policies and things like that in your classroom so that when difficult topics come up, you're not caught off guard, you're prepared, and your learners are prepared. Then we'll talk about how maintenance of these things. So when it does inevitably come up, how you can navigate that. And then finally, self-management, because we need to recognize our role in the classroom as well and the work that we need to do. So we're going to go ahead and start with setup. And setup, as I briefly mentioned, really has to do with what you are doing in the classroom before difficult topics come up. So we want to be explaining to our learners why a classroom culture of respect is important, how that contributes to an environment where everyone can feel safe to learn. Set those ground rules together, right? I use words like policies and rules. And maybe expectations is a little better. It's more of a conversation and agreement between the learners in the room. And then finally, posting those things so that everyone who's in the space can be reminded of them when it's important. So the first thing that we're going to take a look at is those sort of classroom expectations. And as Andrea and I were putting this together, I was sort of reflecting on the fact that at different times in my teaching career, I have skipped the classroom expectations conversation with my learners, especially I think sometimes in open enrollment settings that feels sort of difficult or pointless because it feels like, well, new people just keep coming in. Or I've had this conversation with learners and we get some sort of kind of very general, vague statements that either learners think they're supposed to say or they've heard in other settings, things like respecting each other, which obviously we want to respect each other. But especially in classrooms where people are coming from different cultural backgrounds, different worldviews, what that means and what that looks like might be very different. And so we talked about it's really valuable to sort of unpack that with the learners and have a discussion about what is it that we mean when we say we respect each other. And Andrea had a really great example.
Yeah, so this is something that I've done, actually just did like 3 weeks ago. But that idea of we keep learners often, and all of us throw out the word respect. However, the word respect has very different cultural connotations and means very different things to different people, even people from the same culture. It can mean different things. So some of the questions that I'll ask is when we're talking about we need to respect each other is asking, what does respect sound like? What does it look like? What does it feel like? How do you feel when somebody respects you? And then we'll come up with some really concrete examples. So respect means that you listen to people when it's their turn to talk. And it means that you be nice when someone doesn't know the answer. And that the teacher will check homework, but will understand when people are too busy to finish. So that respect goes both ways. It's not just learners to the teacher or learners to each other, is also respect. I think it's important to talk about what does respect look like from the teacher to the learners. And you can get some really interesting information out of this conversation When I was talking to my class a few weeks ago about it, one of the things that learners said is they're like, we want you. We want you to tell us when we make mistakes. And we want you to tell people what they should do in class, like tell people to turn off their phone. So that idea that it's also respectful for the teacher to be making sure that you're checking in and meeting the needs of students. But yeah, even at very, at literacy levels, you can have some of these conversations about, if you respect someone, show me what you do. And when you have that framework established, it's something that you can keep referring back to as a group.
Yeah, I love that you have learners talk about their expectations for you as well in that conversation. So the next couple of things we're going to look at are some common practices, right? I talked about practices and routines and things that we want to have in place. And we're going to kind of have them in 4 buckets, and then I'll give you examples of how we did this. So the first one is reflecting back. The second one is taking the issue off the student, reflection time, and then fostering understanding. And when you look at our slideshow afterwards in the participant folder, there's a link here at the bottom to the handbook for facilitating difficult conversations. And that's where we've taken these 4 practices from. So the first one is reflecting back. And reflecting back is really about making sure you understand what somebody else is saying, so you can do that sort of, I think I heard you say, kind of checking that you understood, or checking comprehension. And as we sort of unpack this, we used these sentence stems that come from Conversation Cafe. And you can see, tell me more about, this is what I heard you say. Is that what you meant? That's that very classic reflecting back conversation move. But then also, there's a lot of connections to things you might already be doing in class. Again, this is the setup phase. So this is putting in routines for respectful conversations. And so I included these 2 posters here because these are common things teachers are already using. The math talk moves are how to have constructive conversations in the math class, right? We want to get students to the communication stage in the math classroom. And so you have these revoicing stems, repeating stems, reasoning, adding on. And then on the left, towards the bottom here, these are more maybe like an ELA or really just any kind of academic discussion stems. And so having these as things that you're frequently doing in your classroom means that later on, when you get to a difficult topic, your students already know how to use these to have a respectful conversation with one another, instead of, no, that's stupid, you're wrong, and some other things that maybe more naturally come to mind when things get heated. So the next practice is taking the issue off the student. And this conversation structure or format task is shared with us by Jessica Jones. And this is something that she does in her classroom frequently, where she's got 3 students talking to one another. And she gives them a question to sort of get the conversation started, a prompt. And then the first person's going to answer with what they think. The next person's going to restate it. There's another opportunity to reflect back. And then the third person is going to ask a follow-up question. But sometimes those questions that come up, when the student answers it, they're answering from their opinion or their thoughts on the issue, and they might feel the need to defend themselves and get defensive. And so what I really liked about how she has framed the prompt is, for example, in this one, sometimes people don't fix problems in their home. Why? So not you, So you need to feel you feel that you need to defend yourself, but instead we're kind of taking it off of me and thinking about these like anonymous other people, hypothetical other people. And so that just sort of lowers the stakes. I don't have to defend my thoughts and my actions on this issue, but I can kind of open it up and maybe try to change perspectives a little bit as well. So the next thing that we're going to do is actually give you an opportunity to practice some of this reframing. So again, this is an example of maybe talking about that classic ESL topic, problems in the home, and then you're going to report it to the landlord, something like that. We've reframed it, we've reworded it to be about somebody else, so I don't have to defend my position. So we are going to put up some prompts, and how we're going to do this is we'll have everybody try to reframe the prompt in the chat. So you'll read maybe the comment or the example that we've heard in our spaces. You're going to think about how you would reframe it so that it takes the issue off the student who's said this statement or made this statement. And then when we say hit enter, everybody will hit enter and all of the responses will come up at once. It's called like a waterfall chat. So the first one that we're going to think about is she can't use the computer. She's too old. Okay. And so somebody has shared this thought about their classmate or their family member, and you want to reframe it so that this can be a discussion topic where we don't have to attack the person who shared that this is their thoughts. They don't have to feel defensive. We can sort of open it up a little bit more. Okay. If you've got your response in the chat, how you would reframe that, go ahead and hit enter. Okay. So I see a couple folks have sort of just restated that, and that's one way we can reframe it. We're all learning new things.
I like the is age an obstacle to learning? Like that seems like you could have some really good questions. Or how do people sometimes make assumptions about people's abilities based on age? So what we're getting at is ageism. Mm-hmm. Like we're going to have a conversation about ageism, but doing it in a way that is going to be encouraging the learners to be coming up with, wait a minute. Let's see, I'm looking through some other ones, you know, or maybe like, why is it more difficult for elderly people to use technology? To have a conversation about that, that's kind of building some empathy. What is the reality of being older and trying to do something that is brand new?
Yeah. And I really like, so I started to say, you know, sometimes we can just restate it as a statement, but I really like opening it up and reframing it as a question, right? Because as you mentioned, you know, you reframe it in that first way. We can have a conversation about ageism. In the second way, that the second example you pulled out of the chat, we're able to have a conversation about the barriers. And so it's not about this particular learner anymore. It's about these bigger issues. Okay, we're gonna do a couple more of these practices, so I don't want to dwell too long. The next one is, I don't understand why so many people are still refusing to get vaccinated. So again, think about how you could reframe this as a question that can really open up a conversation, a dialogue about what bigger things are at play here. Okay, if you've got some thoughts in the chat, go ahead and hit enter. I like what are some reasons people are hesitant about being vaccinated? That can open up conversations about there's not just like one reason why.
And I also like kind of making it more broad. What makes people fear change?
Ooh.
So what are some of those things that make people afraid of something new? Or from Karen, what information do people use to make decisions? What choices are available? So having a conversation about it, but kind of on a higher, more meta level.
That's great. Okay. Please feel free to keep, as you're putting your reframing questions or reframing statements in there, keep adding those. We do have one more example for this practice. So this one says, did you see the Black Lives Matter people looting? So this one's a example you might have heard maybe last summer or even more recently, but thinking about, again, how can we reframe this for a broader discussion? We'll give a little bit more time this time for people to get their responses in there.
And we want to acknowledge that these might be difficult, and that this is the whole purpose is like having difficult conversations in the classroom. These are all things that we have heard. So how do you then respond and start a productive conversation around it? And yeah, take it off the learner and make it into a more broad issue.
Okay, I think you can go ahead and hit enter if you haven't already. I saw a response. What are some reasons minority populations in your country feel anger? And I think that's a really interesting way to connect it to more global things that students may have experienced at home, sort of really widen what the conversation is going to include.
Yeah, and I appreciate what Erin said with turning it to emotions, and then what were some of the ways that people reacted. People reacted in a huge variety of ways. So looking at the bigger picture. And then I do appreciate Peter's, how did Black Lives Matter leaders respond to looting when it happened? So looking at what was the response from the leadership, because that really can tell a powerful tale. These are great. These are really great questions. Just asking, like, why are people upset? And I like Rachel's wondering. I wonder how social movements in the past were able to create change. Like that sounds like a question that you could do a very deep dive into. Like, let's do some reading. What are major social movements that happened that today we think of as being very positive? What did those look like at the time? How were they talked about? Oh, these are fantastic, everybody. Thank you.
Okay, again, like, please keep adding more into the chat as you consider to mull these over, but we're gonna just keep moving. The next practice that we're going to talk about is reflection. And something that I have done in the past with learners is just introducing some mindfulness practices into the classroom and really talking about, like, why, right? What stress does, the fight or flight response, and how that affects our brain's ability to remember the things that we've learned. I've worked with GED learners who say, I know this when we do it in class. I go take the test, I forgot everything. I've worked with lots of English language learners doing like mock interviews and things like that. Again, learners are saying, I have all these skills, I know all these things. I get to the interview, my mind is blank. And so that's a really great entry point to just say, like, hey, you know, this is what happens to our brains when we're stressed out. That's totally normal. Here are some strategies that you can use to kind of help calm down that fight or flight response. And so, you know, we've talked about breathing. Breathing is a really nice one because you can do it while you're taking the GED test. You don't need a yoga mat or whatever in the room with you. I had a coworker a few years ago who, in stressful meetings and situations like that, would say, okay, I'm going into observer mode now. I'm just going to kind of watch and listen what's going on and sort of try to separate myself. And then, of course, we like to build in time for students to, you know, think, pair, share, or write about something before they contribute to the discussion. And these are all ways that we can kind of slow down what's happening before we respond. And having these sorts of practices in place, we don't want to introduce these practices for the first time in a stressful situation or a difficult conversation. We want to already have these in place and be used to using them. And so having these built in regular class time as a routine that you do in the classroom really help prepare students for using it later on. And then the last practice that we're going to talk about is fostering understanding. And I used these sentence frames that are provided here to have a couple of different difficult conversations in the last couple of years. And this comes from Courageous Conversations, which we use at St. Paul Public Schools. And they have this compass with these 4 quadrants. The believing quadrant, which is really relying on your beliefs or your values. The thinking quadrant, which is really like in situations, some people have a tendency to immediately want to like reflect, learn more, do a lot of thinking before they respond. I am an acting quadrant. When something happens, I immediately am like, all right, what are we gonna do? I wanna go out and do something. And then other people respond by connecting with their emotions and talking about how they're feeling in the moment. And what I like about this is that it recognizes we all have a tendency to show up in one of these quadrants, but in order to get to that centered place, we really need to move through the other quadrants as well. And so as somebody who likes to act, immediately I need to reflect on my beliefs and my values. I need to think about, okay, why do I want to do what I want to do? What emotion am I responding to? What else do I need to learn? And so I talked about this with students. We talked about these 4 quadrants, and then I gave them the opportunity to sort of complete these sentences using these sentence frames about where they were. We did this after George Floyd's murder and the uprising. We also did this after Breonna Taylor's murder was not indicted. And students really shared a lot about where they were coming from. They learned a lot about one another. Students were asking each other questions. And so that this really gets at that fostering understanding. And obviously these sentence frames can be used more than just for those kinds of conversations that can be a regular part of the discussion. So before we move on to the maintenance section, I also wanted to share just a clip from this longer video, which we will provide the link for so you can watch the whole thing. There's lots of great stuff in here. And Amy from Freshwater Education was generous enough to share with us some of the strategies that she used. So we're gonna just watch a quick clip here. You can go ahead and play that, Andrea.
But what's nice about the Storia stuff is it's something that we can all relate to no matter where we're from. And we can all get on the bandwagon of maybe it's not so great to be consuming so much stuff. It might have an impact on our lives in so many different ways. So there's a lot of points of agreement in this topic, in this difficult conversation. So if you're just beginning to teach your students how to have difficult conversations, choose a topic where there's many points of agreement possible instead of choosing something right away that's going to be lots of points of disagreement. This will build community, and that's your first and should be your primary concern first in your classroom as you inculcate a culture of listening and creating learners instead of leaders in this is the goal, right, for difficult conversations, is to inculcate a classroom where you are listening and posturing as a learner.
Yeah, so again, I just think Amy's video there summarizes really well that you want to start with a conversation where there's lots of common ground so that you get these routines and norms sort of practiced before you go on to more difficult topics.
All right, we're gonna jump into our second topic, which is maintenance, kind of that second step of being able to have difficult conversations in the classroom. And, you know, a lot of the first step in maintenance is making sure that you are referring back to the setup. So referring back to those classroom expectations, the fact that you have created a classroom community, the fact that you've done work and intentional practice around respectfully disagreeing with each other. We also, a part of maintenance is modeling constructive disagreement in the classroom as a teacher. And I think also a big part of that is modeling constructive disagreement and also modeling changing your mind. That as the teacher, you know, we don't always have to be right. And it can be really powerful for a teacher to be like, huh, hey, that's a really good point. I hadn't thought about it before. Like, I'm gonna need to sit down and do some thought about this. And then another thing that technique we can do is use anonymous polling to demonstrate the full range of views on a topic that oftentimes, you know, I find myself as a teacher, I talk to a lot of other teachers who can expect everybody in their class to be on the same page. And then when you do anonymous polling where people are able to answer a question honestly without feeling like they're going to have to defend their topic or being afraid that people will think differently of them, that can really be kind of eye-opening and illuminating to see that there is a full range of views on a topic and can make people feel more comfortable with being able to have difficult conversations. So we're going to talk about tackling a surprise difficult conversation because, you know, we all know that sometimes things come up, oftentimes things come up in our lesson plans. So I want to emphasize that, you know, we're going to talk about different options, and I want to emphasize that these are options. How you're going to respond is going to depend on who your learners are, of course, the relationship that you have with them and that they have with one another, and also how effectively you've established the routines and the practices mentioned in that setup portion. And of course, the type of comment and the type of kind of difficult conversation that comes up is going to inform how you respond. So tackling a surprise difficult conversation, our first option is to kind of take it on head first in the moment. So we can do this, you know, take on the conversation as an academic exercise that we're going to discuss in class. And here are some of our options for taking on this. We can help learners frame their point as a specific claim. So that can be, you know, what we've been practiced above, where somebody has an opinion, like, all right, well, let's turn that into a question that we can have a discussion about that, again, takes the blame or kind of removes the individual person from it. And this is something that people can practice. It's a really valuable skill. Then we can open it up for class discussions but with consistent reminders to be doing active listening, like repeat back what was heard, and to ask curiosity questions, ask follow-up curiosity questions before responding. And on the next slide, we'll unpack what curiosity questions are. We also have a responsibility to refer to relevant points from class materials. You know, as we're having these difficult conversations, be bringing the focus back to the text lesson and highlight the relevance of the content to the conflict. You know, like we are having this conversation about kind of essentially about ageism, about people being too old to be able to do things. You know, remember last week or right now we're reading about somebody overcoming obstacles. You know, how is this an obstacle that people overcome? Also thinking about going to the meta level. And this was actually already really well illustrated in that activity we did previously. So that idea of going higher, like, for example, what do you think, why do you think this X is such a hot button issue? Why do people have so many emotions around, for example, getting a vaccine? So being able to kind of remove ourselves completely and talk about the bigger picture. And again, there were some great examples of that in the previous activity. And then, of course, using I statements instead of talking about you or those people. And then, of course, we want to make sure we move on and transition back into the lesson, back into the planned lesson, so that it doesn't derail the class completely and that learners can trust that these big, difficult conversations might come up, but we know that the teacher will get us back on track and we'll be able to continue doing the planned learning. So I did think it was important to pause, and Kris and I thought it was important to pause and talk about, you know, intentional questioning and the difference between agenda questions and curiosity questions. So agenda questions are when we're doing advice, challenges, and one's own belief about a topic, but disguising it as an inquiry, disguising it as a question. You know, don't you know the problem with, haven't you considered, have you thought about how this must feel? You know, you have a specific agenda in mind and you're trying to get the other person to agree with your agenda and to say you're right. And the difference between agenda questions versus curiosity questions. And curiosity is when there is space to explore possibilities for people to respond with what they value, believe, or figure out for or about themselves. So questions like, what makes this important to you? What led you to this point of view? What experiences have you had with this? Where have you heard that? Why, you know, kind of that getting into the where and the why, but with genuine curiosity, as opposed to trying to get somebody to change their mind and to agree with you. And this is something that when I saw it, I was like, oh, I've learned about this in therapy. And something that I've found to be really helpful when I'm navigating like relationship discussions and talking about hot button issues with people in my family in particular.
Andrea, I just noticed the agenda questions. I don't know why I didn't notice this before, are all yes or no questions. And those curiosity questions are all open-ended questions. We talk a lot about that in my classes, in my English classes.
Great. Yeah, I hadn't even really thought about that, but yeah, you're expecting somebody, and the correct answer is yes. Essentially, the correct answer is yes. All right, so our second option for tackling a surprise, difficult conversation in class is to focus on personal responses or to pause until later. So this might mean that you pause for a moment of constructive reflection. So this could be 1-minute papers, reflecting on the situation and how learners are feeling about it, their emotions, and then maybe turning and talking to a partner about their emotions. So it's going to be kind of brief, it's going to be contained, but it'll clearly acknowledge that reflection, but then we'll transition back into the class, but pausing for a moment of that constructive reflection. Also, another thing we can do is take time to acknowledge the importance of the issue and talking about it, and invite learners to connect outside of class as needed before transitioning back to the lesson. This is a really big topic. I can tell there are a lot of emotions about it. And this is something that are really important for us to be having conversations with and thinking about how we feel. I want to make sure that you know that if you want to talk about this further, you can talk about this with me after class. Right now, we're going to go ahead and move back with the lesson, but please feel free to stay after class if this is something you'd like to discuss with me further. And then another thing that we can do that kind of pause it later is do just that. Say, this is a really big topic. I am not ready to lead a discussion on this. I need to do some reading and check in with myself about how I feel and come up with some good questions that I can ask so that we can talk about this. Let's plan on talking about this tomorrow or next week. And this can be a really good way to model constructive conflict. That sometimes it's okay to say, this in discussion is too important for us to have right now, but I think we should have it. Let's come back to it later when we're ready. And another thing that can be used with that, focusing on the personal responses or kind of doing a pause to later is to know that humor can be really valuable when we're having these difficult topics come up. But if you are using humor, we want to make sure that we're not using it at the expense of a marginalized group or individual, and that a student who made the comment shouldn't feel shamed that they are being made fun of. So just keeping that in mind, like humor can be very, very valuable, but it's important for all of us to be thinking about how is this landing? I always think about, is this punching up or is this punching down? All right, and then the third thing that can be done is responding to an offensive comment. And you'll notice there is not an option for this. This is just something that needs to be done. And I think all of us know how hard it can be to respond to an offensive comment, particularly when you know that the comment wasn't made maliciously, and how hard it can be to have somebody respond to an offensive comment that you've made. I know when I say something offensive and people respond to it, like there's a lot of shame that comes along with that, but it is so critical. This is how we learn, is by having people respond to that. So the number one thing we need to make sure we're doing is don't ignore it. Don't pretend that we didn't hear it. And I, as a longtime teacher, can think of so many times that somebody said something and I was like, I don't even know what to do. I'm just going to pretend that I didn't hear it and hope that other people didn't as well and just keep going. But we really can't do that. We have a responsibility to our learners to respond. Because not responding sends a message that such behavior is okay. And it can mean that the classroom isn't a safe space for learners who belong to the targeted minoritized group. We also want to make sure, and again, this is something that I have worked on and am continuing to work on, is not letting your fear of saying the right thing stop you from saying anything. So this is that perfectionist mindset. If I can't say it perfectly, then I'm just not going to say anything. Because what if I say the wrong thing and I make it worse? That's legitimate fear, but it's really important to say something. And it could be as simple as, using that word to put someone down as unacceptable, or that's not funny. We don't tell these jokes in the classroom. Or even my personal favorite that I've learned and have employed is just saying like, whoa, huh, and like clearly indicating that you are taken aback by what was just said and that it was not okay. And we do want to assume good intentions. This is important to assume good intentions. But assuming good intentions doesn't mean that somebody is off the hook for what they said. What it means is, of course, they don't want to say something like that again. That could be harmful. So this is where that educating follow-up part comes in. You know, that word has really taken on a different meaning recently. Or I don't think you meant that the way it sounded. Did you mean, which I realize is a leading question, as an agenda question. But that idea that we're giving somebody the benefit of the doubt, like that actually was pretty sexist, or that was pretty ageist. I don't think you meant to be sexist or ageist. I think you meant to imply that, you know, this is more difficult. So you're giving somebody kind of an easy out. So yeah, this is just, so hard, but so important. And I had this in class 2 days ago where a learner made a comment. Another student from the school had their cell phone stolen. My class said it was probably a Black person who took it. And I was able to completely recognize what was happening, that I was like, oh, I don't know how to answer this, so I should just pretend I didn't hear it. And then went, nope, I have to say something. Like, I have to say something. I don't know if what I said was the perfect thing. In fact, I'm sure I've been thinking about it ever since. I'm sure there are better things I could have said, but I made a point of saying, I disagree, you know, and the reason I disagree is because, and so I addressed it directly. And we talked about how it's important to be careful to not make, you know, broad statements about a group based on the actions of one, and especially the imaginary actions of one person. And I think it can be, you know, I want to acknowledge that I am a white woman, and I am working in a class with all of my learners are people of color, which I think can make this responding to an offensive comment like particularly fraught for me. And I heard a statement one time from the Minnesota, the group, the Coalition for Asian American Leaders in Minnesota. I was on a call with some of them, and one of them said, you know, learners in classes can be both the victims and the perpetrators of bigotry and bias. Both can be true at the same time. So that is something that I definitely hold. I watch myself, and I also am trying to be more intentional about making a point to speak up when I hear things. All right, so we are going to listen to a short video, a short, fairly humorous video that has a really, really good point for that. How do you respond to an offensive comment? How do you speak up when somebody says something offensive? And in particular, this one is digging into racism. I do want to warn people, there are a couple of swear words in this, so just be prepared that you will hear a couple of swear words. It's light, it's funny, but the message really rings true, and it's actually an extremely powerful tool. All right, so we'll come back in 2 minutes after this video.
Race, the final frontier. No matter what channel you watch, no matter what feed you aggregate, it seems like everybody everywhere is talking about race right now. And when everybody everywhere is talking about race, that means sooner or later you're gonna have to tell somebody that they said something that sounded racist. So you need to be ready and have a plan in place for how to approach the inevitable "that sounded racist" conversation. And I'm going to tell you how to do that. The most important thing that you've got to do is remember the difference between the "what they did" conversation and the "what they are" conversation. Those are two totally different conversations, and you need to make sure that you pick the right one. The what they did conversation focuses strictly on the person's words and actions and explaining why what they did and what they said was unacceptable. This is also known as the "that thing you said was racist" conversation, and that's the conversation that you want to have. The what they are conversation, on the other hand, takes things one step further and uses what they did and what they said to draw conclusions about what kind of person they are. This is also known as the "I think you are a racist" conversation. This is the conversation you don't want to have, because that conversation takes us away from the facts of what they did and the speculation about their motives and intentions, and those are things you can only guess at, you can't ever prove, and that makes it way too easy for them to derail your whole argument. And that is the part that's crucial to understand. When you say, "I think he's a racist," that's not a bad move because you might be wrong. That's a bad move because you might be right. Because if that dude really is racist, you want to make sure you hold him accountable and don't let him off easy. And even though intuitively it feels like the hardest way to hit him is just run up on him and say, "I think you're racist," when you handle it that way, you're actually letting him off easy, because you're setting up a conversation that's way too simple for him to derail and duck out of. Just think about how this plays out every time a politician or a celebrity gets caught out there. It always starts out as a "what they did" conversation, but as soon as the celebrity and their defenders get on camera, they start doing judo flips and switching it into a "what they are" conversation. "I have known this person for years, and I know for a fact that they are not a racist, and how dare you claim to know what's inside their soul just because they made one little joke about watermelon tap dancing and going back to Africa." And then you try and explain that we don't need to see inside their soul to know that they shouldn't have said all that about the watermelon, and you try to focus on the facts of the situation, but by then it's too late, because the "what they are" conversation is a rhetorical Bermuda Triangle where everything drowns in a sea of empty posturing until somebody just blames it all on hip-hop and we forget the whole thing ever happened. Don't let this happen to you. When somebody picks my pocket, I'm not going to be chasing him down so I can figure out whether he feels like he's a thief deep down in his heart. I'm going to be chasing him down so I can get my wallet back. I don't care what he is, but I need to hold him accountable for what he did. And that's how we need to approach these conversations about race. Treat them like they took your wallet and focus on the part that matters, holding each person accountable for the impact of their words and actions. I don't care what you are. I care about what you did.
All right. We are going to go ahead and do a practice with thinking about those different approaches. We have the academic exercise. We have pausing until later, and we have shutting it down if something is offensive and just needs to be addressed immediately in class. So we're going to do a similar thing. I'm going to put up a comment, and these are all comments that Kris and I have heard learners say, or learners or volunteers or other teachers say throughout our time as educators. And what we'd like you to do is say, which approach would you use? 1, 2, or 3. And then if you're able to put in just, a brief explanation of why you would use that one. So again, you don't need to talk about what you would say in response. So don't worry about what you would say. Just think about which approach would you use. All right, so I'm going to put up the first one. A white service learner volunteer makes self-effacing comments about her handwriting being so ghetto. So in the chat, if you wouldn't mind pausing, let's do about 30 seconds. Go ahead, type your answer, but wait to hit enter. And we'd like to hear 1, 2, or 3, and then if you can just do like a couple words of explanation as to why you would pick that one. All right, about 10 more seconds to type. All right, go ahead and hit enter. What would you do? All right, so I'm seeing a really wide range here, 1, 2s, and 3s. I'm including giving background knowledge for explanation and discussion. 1 or 3 talk about the meaning and challenge the phrase. Maybe having a conversation privately with a volunteer later. Maybe 3, because it's acknowledged as not okay. It's not a student, but someone who needs to be aware of the expectations in the environment. Great. So it seems like everybody agrees that, yep, we need to acknowledge this. And there's no right answers for, what you do. It's the what works, what would work the best for you. Any thoughts, Kris, before we jump on to the next one?
No, I was about to point out the same one that you did, that especially because this is a service learner and a volunteer, making sure that this is somebody who is contributing to the environment that is being created for learners. And so that's especially important. We always want to be thinking about how the level of safety that other people in the room are experiencing. And, there's a certain amount of, I don't know that volunteers always realize the amount of power they have in the room, but often learners think of them the same as the teacher, and that's a lot of power in the room, and making sure that we're doing that education with our volunteers as well to make sure that that environment is safe and welcoming.
Great, thank you. Excellent point. All right, our next one, and Kris, would you want to give the background on this one, since this was pulled from your class, your experience?
Sure. So students, he did wait until the other students had left at the end of the day, but this is a Somali man who has lived in the United States for about 20 years. And he said to me, Trump is so funny. He said, those countries are shithole countries. How do you spell shithole? And he didn't fill me in on what he intended to do with that spelling, but he did ask. So yeah, go ahead and think about how you would respond. And I'm happy to share how I responded to once when we sort of go over these. But yeah, are you going to approach this as an academic exercise? Are you going to pause until later? Or are you going to shut it down?
All right, and love to hear the why. All right, so if you have your why typed, go ahead and hit enter. I appreciate from Joanna, I need to gather my thoughts.
Andrea, I got bumped out. I'm back. Are we wrapping up the comments?
Yeah, so a couple things, maybe 1 or 2 people are saying that they would need some more time to prepare, gather thoughts and think about, maybe gather some information. A lot of people saying, 1, thinking of it's an academic exercise, explain the negative, how negative the word is, and alternatives. So yeah, are there other words that could be, it's a good chance to learn why somebody feels that way or why it isn't helpful.
Yeah, I actually did just approach this as an academic exercise, and I said, I think you know how to spell that. What letters say shh? And we spelled it together. And that further conversations definitely need to follow. But for this particular instance, this was this guy's belief and opinion he'd shared with me many times. I didn't feel like I was going to change it. And B, he did not say it in front of anyone else. And so it was not a matter of, maintaining a level of feeling and a feeling of welcome and safety in the room. And so we spelled it together.
All right, let's go. I love that example. let's jump to 3. So here we have a student laughs as they mimic another student's body language in an exaggerated way, gesturing with their arm extended, wrist loose. So we can make some assumptions that the learner who is mimicking another student is making fun of their perceived sexuality. So what would you do? 1, 2, or 3? And if people have a couple words of explanation, why would you choose that? I like 3 for immediately, but later make sure that 1 happens. Okay. And I'm seeing from people, that's disrespectful. We just don't allow that in the classroom.
Yeah, lots of 3s for this one. Right?
Yeah. And I see a point from Dave. It's the immediate issue of a student's safety and security.
Absolutely.
Right. All right. This is the one that it looks like pretty much everybody is in agreement on. And then maybe I see a few people saying, and maybe then do a 2 or a 1 and do a follow-up later to talk about it, but it needs to be shut down in the moment. All right, so hopefully this gave you some different options of ways that you can approach those difficult conversations or comments. And just, remember, there's no perfect way. It's what works for you, what works for your learners. That's what's the most important. All right, so we're about 3 minutes over, so we have about 3 minutes, Kris, to wrap up our self-management and talk about our resources.
All right, I'll try to be quick here. So earlier I mentioned that the self-management piece is really acknowledging your role in the classroom and the work that you need to do. We are humans too. We have things that trigger us, that make us angry, that make us anxious, that trigger that fight or flight response. And we need to identify what those are and have a plan. Sometimes that means going to the meta level, like Andrea talked about earlier. Somebody talking about trauma-informed teaching at one point said, don't ask what's wrong with you, ask what happened to you. And that really helps me reframe situations that I encounter. And then obviously we need to do our own work and continue to grow. So obviously this is not a one and done. So we're gonna just provide resources for you all that we found valuable.
So letting people know there's tons of resources out there for further learning, and these slides are available in the slides for this presentation. So there is a PDF with all of these links live, and Marisa just shared the participant folder. So, Atlas Cultural Competency Library has a wealth of ideas. And then there's a couple of different articles about managing classroom conflict and tips and strategies for difficult classrooms that are great for further reading.
We also have that link to Amy's full video. There's so many concrete examples that she uses with learners. I really take the time to watch that video. And then some of the things that we referenced, speak up, responding to everyday bigotry, and making it meaningful, interrupting biased comments in the classroom. More things for you to access. A colleague, oh yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say that responding to everyday bigotry, I love, because I often have problems feeling like I'm finding the right words, and it has some really concrete recommendations for sentence starters and things that you can use to push back in a huge variety of situations.
The next resource we have for you is behind a paywall, but if you're in a program where you have an account with the ESL library, or if you have one, a colleague recently shared with me the language of sensitive subjects, and these are, again, sentence stems. We didn't have these when we put the thing together, but then someone shared it because we were talking about difficult conversations with students in a team meeting, go figure. So take a look at that if if that's something you have access to. All right, we went over again, Andrea, I think.
Only 1 minute. So thank you everybody so much. We really appreciate you being here. We know that this is a really important topic to you. This is an important topic to us personally. So we really appreciate you being here, learning with us and letting us share some of our experiences, and love to hear if anybody uses any of these options, how it works in your class.
All right, well, thanks so much, everyone. Thanks to Andrea and Kris for the wonderful presentation. I just put links to the participant folder, also the event flyers, so you can get to your next session, which begins at 11 a.m. So enjoy the rest of the conference. And again, thank you to our presenters.
Thanks,
Bye,
everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.